Today on Advanced Nuclear, we're sitting down with one of the most important lawyers you've probably never heard of. Amy Roma has spent 20 years building the playbook for first of a kind nuclear projects, including the world's first commercial fusion deal. If a reactor company is doing something nobody's done before, there's a good chance Amy is involved. Let's get into it.
Welcome to Advanced Nuclear, the official podcast of UCAN Power, where leading experts, innovators, and policymakers explore the latest developments shaping the future of nuclear energy. Thanks to our sponsors of Advanced Nuclear, whose support helps make these discussions possible. Cybernetic intelligence, sovereign compute, uncompromised security, and resilient power built end to end.
Welcome to Advanced Nuclear, the official podcast of UCAN Power. I'm Dominique Cooper. Today, we're sitting down with Amy Roma, one of the top nuclear regulatory attorneys in the country. She joined ORIC this past February after nearly 20 years at her previous firm. She's testified before Congress, structured the world's first commercial fusion power deal, and just published 2 pieces on the new frontiers of nuclear: reactors in space and reactors at sea. If you want to understand what it actually takes to build advanced nuclear right now, Amy's the person to ask. Views are her own, not UCAN's. Amy, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks, Dominique. Glad to be here today.
Awesome. So let's just get directly into it. I like to start off with the beginning, right? The impetus, the origin. Why nuclear? What pulled you into this?
I wish I had an exciting reason to say that I was particularly driven to nuclear. I will tell you that I started off 3 years as a biochemistry major in college, realized if I spent one more minute in a lab, I would hate my life. And so I changed to philosophy, decided to go to law school. But the one thing I knew early on is that I needed to be intellectually stimulated, and I need to feel like I'm doing something that makes the world a better place. If I don't have those 2 things, I'm going to get bored pretty quickly. So when I worked at a large law firm in my summers during law school, the world seemed really boring to me. It was litigation and corporate law. I didn't see anything that I thought was particularly interesting. I also knew I wouldn't survive very long in that environment unless I thought something was interesting. So I decided to look at government agencies, and I pretty early on met Steve Burns, who subsequently became chairman of the NRC, but at the time was head of legal recruiting for the agency. And he loved his job. And he did something really interesting. It was nuclear. I didn't really know much about it, but I figured, hey, I could go work at an agency for a couple of years, do a clerkship, see if I like it, and then see if I want to stay with it. And the rest is history. So I did that for 2 years, worked at the NRC, at their internal court, the Atomic Safety and Licensing Board. Thought that was really interesting, went into private practice, and then, here I am today.
Oh my gosh, what a wonderful story. So I was doing, I say this almost on every episode. It is such a pleasure when I'm doing my research on, upcoming guests. And I think I remember reading something about you stating the importance of making projects licensable and financeable. Could you help us understand what that actually means and identify the gap between getting the NRC approval and actually getting something built?
Yeah, it's actually interesting. So during the last round of COLAs, I left the NRC. I worked on the licensing of a uranium enrichment facility. And then I went into the last wave of new applications in the United States. And the thing that you learn early on is that delivering a nuclear project cannot be done in a vacuum. You need to have multiple disciplines working together in order to make a project work. And so during the time, we were constantly talking about financial qualifications of the applicant and lining up the money necessary to build the plant. And the NRC regulations were written so that you had to show where the money was coming from when you submitted your license application. But at the time, we had a bunch of merchant plant applicants that couldn't just pass it on to ratepayers to pay. And they were planning on project financing their projects. So they're like, hey, NRC, we can't show you where the money is coming from. until we get the license, because when they get the license, we then take it out to the market and we line up the project financing and bring in the funds. And so at the time, the NRC didn't know any of this, because when we built the first wave of nuclear, it was all rate-regulated utilities. And then we didn't have a deregulated market, semi-deregulated market come until the 1990s, but we weren't building new plants then. So it was a first-of-a-kind problem for the NRC, and had to really wrap its head around the business of how a new nuclear power plant is built and deployed. At the time, they had to do financial qualification rulemaking to amend the regulations. They kind of made it partway through at the time, but we're catching up for lost time now with some of the rulemakings coming out to change it so that you didn't have to line the money up until afterwards. And like since that time, now that we're deploying a bunch of new nuclear projects, and like the reason that I came to Orrick from my old law firm is because we're really good at this, is how do you create a fully baked project? So it's how do you maximize licensing efficiencies? How do you negotiate and deploy EPC and project development agreements? And then at the end of the day, how do you wrap it all together into a financeable project? And so like you can't think about these things in silos. They all integrate together.
Oh, yeah, I love that. And I mean, I'm pretty sure it kind of alleviates some of the stressors associated with like, getting a new project off the ground. So could we talk part 53? Yeah. Let's get that right. It's a new licensing framework. And apparently there hasn't been a change in over 3 decades. And now that it's alive, and I hope well, for a couple of months, like, could you expound on what is actually working in practice based on where you sit, and what are people still figuring out?
Yeah, so I want to take it back until like what your options are for what your licensing framework is. And so in the original days, it was a Part 50 2-step license. So you submit a construction permit application. You just have to do initial preliminary design work in order to get that license. Then you construct the facility, and then you submit an operating license that has the final detailed design work in it, right? And then the NRC is like, great, you're good to go. You can start operations. You're fine. So then they introduced the Part 52 framework. I think it was finalized so that was like 1956 framework, right? So then fast forward, and the NRC is like, hey, we kind of screwed up this 2-step licensing process during the 1970s, right? Because what we would do is change the regulatory requirements, and projects were so long in construction that like people didn't know that if you submitted a construction permit and then built a facility, you would then have authorization through an operating license to operate the facility. And things were changing. So they implemented a bunch of changes, including the backfit rule that prevents the NRC from going and changing these things. But they're like, you know what? We're going to allow you to do a COLA, a 1-step operating license. It's a combined operating license application that it has the construction permit and the operating license together. So when we had that like last wave of reactor applications in like the 2006 through like 2012 timeframe, they were all COLA applications. And everybody thought this is going to be so easy because you get all the authorizations you need up front, and then you go ahead and you build it, and the NRC just confirms you built it the way you're supposed to, and you're good to go. These are all designed for light water reactors. They're all pretty much designed for large light water reactors. And after the last wave of COLAs, it didn't work well, like including the fact that when you were building the AP1000 for the Vogtle plant, anytime you made changes to your design, like when you figured out, hey, constructability wise, what we thought we would have as our final detailed design, we need to change. You didn't have the flexibility to do that. So you had to constantly go into the NRC and get these license amendments. And so you had a much more stricter framework that applied to you during construction of them. So fast forward to where we are now, right? I got my first advanced reactor client in 2006. Ironically, it was the Toshiba 4S reactor, which I just saw a fusion company license the technology for that. And I'm like, holy cow, like nothing is new under the sun, apparently. And then had some other advanced reactor clients in like the 2007 timeframe. They were really before their time. Like the market wasn't ready for them. At that time, COLAs were just starting to take off, but then the price of natural gas was going down really low. We weren't in the environment we are now, where we have very sharp increase in energy demand needs. And they just kind of fizzled out. They weren't able to raise the money that they needed. But what we did was we looked at the NRC's regulatory framework, and we're like, hey, this isn't geared towards alternative fuels, alternative coolants, these advanced reactors that we're seeing today. And and oftentimes they're overly prescriptive, because when you have smaller designs or you have modular designs and you're kind of building them up incrementally, you don't really need these large, like, gigawatt plus size regulations that are geared towards light water reactors. They're very technically prescriptive and geared towards a technology you don't have. And so companies started looking at, like, how do you change the NRC's regulations to make sure that it works in an efficient way so that you can get timely and efficient licensing and that you have regulatory certainty about what your path is forward. So the NRC started working on things. Congress also passed NEMA, the Nuclear Energy Innovation and Modernization Act in 2019, that said, hey, NRC, like, it's fine, you're going too slow. And you need to develop a risk-informed, technology-neutral framework so that we could license and deploy advanced reactors. Like, you need to think more innovatively, and you need to go further than you've done that before, right? So we saw that happen, and then you saw the Advance Act come that kind of pushed it a little bit further. But that was Part 53. And so that was the Part 50 framework started. It was going off the rails almost from the beginning, where the NRC developed a framework that the industry did not want and said, we will not use this. And so there was multiple congressional hearings. Congress was getting irritated. Like, fast forward to where we are now, like, they amended Part 53 to do a lot of the things that industry said that they needed in order to use it, but it hasn't been used yet. And so when I'm talking to clients and they're looking at what is the licensing framework that we plan on deploying, it's funny to me how many of them are like, and we want Part 50. Because Part 50 is known, Part 50 is certain. You only have to do preliminary design work. You don't have to have that final detailed design work. And they're afraid, I think that everybody's afraid to go through the first of a kind process. We have an agency right now that has shown that it's willing to work with applicants to try to make the process more user-friendly and more efficient. And so the ones that are like, we want to do Part 50 or we want to do Part 52 tend to be next generation light water reactor technologies. But the ones that are advanced reactor technologies are, the TerraPower project got licensed under Part 50. The X-Energy Dow project got licensed under Part 50. But I think at this point, now that Part 53 is kind of out and people know what it looks like, I think a lot of companies are going to be seriously looking at Part 53 for when they kind of deploy the next wave of new reactor applications that are coming in. But you've got to come over that presumption that Part 50 may be a better alternative. And so you've got to kind of weigh the pros and cons, which tend to come down to, when I read Part 53, are the things in there about flexible use of risk methodologies and factory fuel loading and departure from single failure criteria. Are those things that I want in my licensing framework, or do I want to try to figure out how to work under Part 50 or Part 52? And so we're at that phase right now. And then throw in Part 57, like the new rulemaking came in for the micro reactors or the low safety significance reactors. And that's another alternative. So now you have 4 different pathways that you could choose, each of them having pros and cons, including if it's a Part 53 or Part 57, it's like, you're going to be like one of the first movers going through that. And so as long as we have an agency that's willing to be helpful and help applicants move through that for the first instance, then I can see it being a pretty attractive option.
So just out of curiosity here, like what does an assessment look like when, a potential developer is looking to determine which licensing framework they like to follow, right? Like, is that assessment like a 30, 60 day ordeal? What does that look like?
So it ultimately, when I talk to clients about what their options are and which methodology to pick, my first question is, what is your technology? Like, if you're not an advanced reactor, if you're a traditional, and there's a surprising amount of traditional, like, light water reactor SMR developers right now. And so that's like, you're still in a light water reactor framework. You want to do small modular reactors, so you're kind of having smaller units that you built up modularly, so you can have 5, 10 units together, but you're still LWR. And for them, a lot of times they're like, I don't need to be the person who figures out if Part 53 works, and I don't really need it because I can use the traditional licensing framework under Part 50. If they're first of a kind technologies, almost everybody wants Part 50 and plan on using Part 52 for second of a kind, third of a kind technologies when the NRC's already seen what it looks like, but also because you get that flexibility in constructability. Like you don't have to have the final detailed design. You can go with a preliminary design and then go and build it and figure out, does it work the way we thought it was going to work? And so those are the companies that tend to move towards the Part 50, Part 52 discussions. But the advanced reactors, the ones that use alternative fuels, alternative coolants, the ones that plan to have, remote operations or want more flexibility with their operator siting. And that oftentimes goes into what's your business plan. So not only what is your technology, but what's your business plan? And those are the ones that are more looking to the Part 53, or if they're smaller technology, the Part 57 framework.
Right. Yeah. Because I was thinking, I'm pretty sure there's also like a capital consideration in, which pathway they're going to explore based on, number one, funding and timeframes, and I'm even thinking maybe even workforce, right? Let's transition over to data centers and nuclear, right? Because, a lot for some people, that's essentially like knocking at their front door. And I mean, I say this loosely. It feels like, every week there's some sort of deal where there's a data center and a nuclear relationship forming.
Yeah.
When you think about Microsoft and Google and, they sit down to a nuclear offtake deal, what are they actually asking for that a utility would not?
So I would say, think about it this way. One is, you are correct. Like, it is not hyperbole to say like weekly announcements are coming out, right? It's Meta, Google, Amazon, Microsoft all have nuclear announcements, all plan on participating in nuclear projects. I would say, think about them in three different bins. One is the offtake agreement with a existing operating nuclear power plant. And so that would be like the Susquehanna nuclear power plant that has a co-located data center, and then the data center buys power from that plant. So they're buying the power from the utility. There's been a lot of noise at FERC about that, because when you take power away from the grid and dedicate it to a utility, to a data center, like, you run the risk of not having enough power available to the grid. And like things like PJM already does not have enough power for the data, for the energy needs that they have in their market. So PJM is the largest energy market in the country. It's 13 states, but those states include Pennsylvania, for example, but also my state, my home state of Virginia, where when you said for some people it's literally knocking on their door, I live in Northern Virginia, where I take my son to his soccer practice every Saturday and Sunday, and I drive past all the data centers. The good news is they show up gray on my maps, on my car.
Yeah.
But the soccer fields I'm going to is that little piece of green. And so that the first type of arrangement you're talking about is like an offtake agreement with an operating nuclear power plant. The second type of arrangement you're talking about is this restart of decommissioning plants. So plants that are in decommissioning, they're getting restarted. An example with that would be the Microsoft 3 Mile Island agreement, where they're restarting one of the units at 3 Mile Island. The other one had a nuclear accident and is no good. So you're restarting it. But I tell people that's enough power for like 750,000 people. Like, that's enough power for a city or these data centers. And so those are really attractive options, because you already have the nuclear infrastructure there. You already haven't gone very far down the road for like pulling the plants apart. And so it's easier to kind of restart them. And then it's an economic decision. Like, is it worth putting the money into this because of the value of the offtake agreement that I can negotiate and the premium price that the offtaker is willing to pay? And so like the answer for like, it almost is always yes, like unless your plant has been completely pulled apart. So then the third is, what does the arrangement look like for new nuclear power plants that are under development? And each of those can be different. So like the X Energies of the world, like Amazon made a direct equity investment, a substantial one, into X Energy, but also entered into an agreement for 5.5 gigawatts of power on the back end. So in that case, it will be an off-taker. I don't know the business arrangements here. You'll probably have a utility involved that will be the operator of the nuclear power plant, probably the owner of the plant. And X-Energy is the reactor vendor, right? For other companies like Oklo, they're a build, own, operate company. And so they'll just enter into offtake agreements with the hyperscalers or whoever needs their energy. And they're building, owning, and operating the plants. And their business model is we enter into these offtake agreements, and that's how we generate our revenue. And then there's kind of hybrid in between, which is, do we see a case where hyperscalers are going to come in and invest in the front end of a project? And so like one of the things is owning and operating a plant during construction is different than owning and operating a plant like when it's operational and producing electrons capable of being added to the grid. So that who owns the plant during construction can be a pretty flexible idea. It can be utilities. It can be a combination of utilities vendors, which is kind of what we saw in the last round of COLAs, or you can bring utilities vendors, hyperscalers, or any other party into who owns it, including a project delivery model, which is a nuclear development company, which is like the Blue Energies of the world, which is like, we're going to kind of build this for you. And then at that point, you can either transfer ownership over to a utility to operate the facility, or you can just transfer the operation over to a utility. There's lots of flexibilities in the business model that a lot of people don't realize. And this is where kind of like understanding regulatory issues matters, is because in a lot of these earlier conversations, you know, for the first round of advanced reactors that were getting licensed, people thought nuclear power plants had to be run by utilities or could only be licensed to utilities that had nuclear experience. If you look at Kairos, if you look at TerraPower, and you look at X-Energy, no utility in sight on any of those three projects. Kairos is a build, own, operate model. The Berkshire Hathaway Energy TerraPower project originally was, it was to replace a retiring coal plant in Wyoming for Berkshire Hathaway Energy, but it turned into a long-term power purchase agreement or a build, own, transfer model. And then the X-Energy Dow project, Dow is an industrial end user, right? So you can bring in a utility who's the third-party operator to operate the plant, but Dow's the one who owns it. And so this model is continuously evolving, and it's evolving in real time right now.
It shouldn't be news to me, but it's kind of news to me because I guess the part that has me scratching my head is, you know, there are entities that could basically build a power plant, but not necessarily be responsible for owning it and operating it. And so I'm thinking about, well, wait, like where do you find the expertise to do that? And so it's interesting to hear you expound on that, because I'm wondering how that plays into the proliferation of, I'm going to use a word, proliferation of, you know, nuclear power plants.
We don't use that word.
Yeah. You know, nuclear power plants across the U.S. It's an interesting thing to really ponder on. So thank you for sharing that.
It's a unique thing that I think people tend, and I don't want to overgeneralize here, but in conversations I have, people tend to think too prescriptively and too narrowly about what the options are. They see how nuclear was deployed in the past, and they assume that is how nuclear would be deployed in the future. It won't. It won't be, because nobody wants to see what happened in Vogtle. They don't want to be the person that Vogtle happens to, right? The cost overruns, the project delays, the complications that happened. People know that building a first-of-a-kind nuclear power plant project is hard, but they don't want to bet the company on it. Like when that happened, when Vogtle happened, right? Like the ratepayers were mad, the government was mad, Westinghouse went into bankruptcy. Toshiba almost got delisted on the Tokyo Stock Exchange. If it did not divest of Westinghouse, it was going to be delisted on the Tokyo Stock Exchange. When you're a utility, you look at that, and they're naturally risk-adverse companies. And so you look at that and you're like, I don't want that to be me. And so you have to, when you look at how nuclear is going to be delivered into the future, it will fundamentally be different than how it was delivered in the past. But when you also look at who has the necessary experience and skill set to deliver new nuclear, it's none of the utilities you're looking at today. None of them built their nuclear power plants, with the exception of Southern Company and Vogtle, right? And then the partially built Scana plant. But for them, that was a first-of-a-kind activity. Nuclear power plants were built so long ago that nobody in the utility remembers how it was done. And in fact, none of them are really with the same utility that constructed them in the first place because they've all transferred ownership over the years. So if you look at the constellations of the world, which has the largest nuclear fleet out there, it didn't build a single plant. And so people assume there's this embedded knowledge and expertise in utilities about how to build and deploy nuclear reactors. And there's not. And when you look at other energy sectors, projects are delivered in a very different way. Where if you want a gas plant, you get a turnkey plant that can be built and handed to you. So utilities are like, can we get that? And the nuclear industry is like, we can't really do turnkey. Like we need to spread and allocate this risk in a different way. So you have to take what works and what doesn't. And what works is having the reactor vendors very involved in the process, having the people who are building the rest of the plant and constructing the plant, the Bechtels and the floor of the world, very active in the process, having the utilities active in the process, because at the end of the day, they're usually going to be the ones that own and operate an operating plant. But you have a lot more fungibility on who else can be involved. And like one of the things that was really interesting about the X-Energy Dow project is Dow is used to building things. Like unlike many utilities who don't build things, Dow builds chemical plants all over the world and has significant experience with that and has many co-located energy facilities at their chemical plants. So they bring a different conversation to the discussion than a lot of other stakeholders would. And I think opening up the umbrella and seeing more people come involved to help solve some of these conversations is exactly what we need right now.
And it's interesting because a lot of people talk about Vogtle and the things that didn't necessarily go as planned, but I think that some of that was probably necessary to inform the innovation that we are witnessing today.
Yeah, you're exactly right.
Yeah.
It's also. So I will just add on Vogtle, right? DOE put a really good report out, the DOE liftoff report, that looked at what happened with Vogtle and found that it was, one, not unique to nuclear, but unique to any large critical infrastructure project because we don't do them very often. And two, it was also unique to Western countries. And so if you look at like the Finnish nuclear power plant, the UK nuclear power plants that they're building, you look at Vogtle, they all are Western countries deciding that they're going to build something they haven't done in a while, doing it, and then deciding it was really hard and people throwing up their hands and saying, ew, we don't want to do that again, right? When they're at the point where if they did it again, they would significantly drive down costs, significantly drive down delays, and you already have a trained workforce. And so other Eastern countries like China and Korea and Japan have all leveraged the economy scales of building multiple reactors, with China in particular deploying, I think they're turning online like 10 reactors a year and have since 2022 with more gigawatts planned by 2030. But they have complete predictability in how long it takes to deploy, how much it costs. They have the workforce completely developed, and they have I think they have an entirely domestic supply chain, right? We can get to these things or get close enough to them, but we can't get them if we build one and decide we're not going to do it anymore.
Exactly. Oh my gosh. Okay. So I want to talk more about China and some of those developments. But before we go there, you published two pieces 2 months ago, back in April, one that talk extensively about reactors in space and reactors at sea. Could you share with the listeners like where we are regulation wise and with nuclear outside of just plugging into the grid? What does that look like at sea and also in space?
It's funny. I will say that so space and maritime nuclear are really interesting. Space nuclear is really important because if you want to have any meaningful amount of like space exploration, including if you want to get further faster, you need nuclear, right? And like, and so
no brainer.
It's funny. I was watching Project Hail Mary this weekend with my kids, and they were like, "We can't get to this very distant spot in space. Like, we don't have the energy for it." And I turned to my kids and I was like, "It's nuclear. It's nuclear. It's going to be nuclear." And then it ended up being some bacteria that didn't exist. And they're like, "You were wrong." I was like, "Well, I'm talking about something that exists," and they just made something up. So like, I feel comfortable with that. But if you want to do like Mars colonization, if you want to have something that lasts longer than the lunar night, that has to last through the lunar night, which is 2 weeks. If you want to do deep space exploration, space mining, you need nuclear. So you need it both for providing power and for propulsion. It allows you to get to Mars a heck of a lot faster. And if you've got human beings on that rocket that's going to Mars, you want it to go as fast as humanly possible, right? If you want those human beings to survive on Mars, you need something like nuclear energy, right? So nuclear is really, really important. And the nuclear space applications are important for not only commercial space, but also geopolitical and national security as well, right? And so being able to operate and function in space is a really important thing for a national security perspective. Maritime and nuclear, and by the way, I would say nuclear and space have a long history. Most of it is with radioisotope decay systems that are powered by the energy generated from radioactive decay. And but then Russia, we've put a reactor in space before. Russia has put a bunch of reactors in space before, and China is planning on putting reactors in space. So that's space. Maritime is really interesting because maritime allows you to remove diesel and replace it with reactors. People think maritime and nuclear is a really big deal, and this is new and innovative, but it's been powering, since the dawn of the nuclear age, when we discovered nuclear energy and created our first nuclear power plant, we have had nuclear propulsion at sea, right? So the Nautilus was the first nuclear powered ship. It was literally designed the same year, it was 1954, when the Nautilus launched, and then they started construction of Shippingport, the first reactor that provided power, right? The first power reactor. And so since that time, it's powered our nuclear navy, the U.S. nuclear navy, and there's been tons of submarines and nuclear powered aircraft carriers that have 6 or 8 reactors on them, and they've had great operational experience. So on the maritime side, it's how can you deploy nuclear reactors for both floating nuclear power plants. So that's a nuclear power plant on a barge that can provide power to remote locations. And so think island nations, think Hawaii, the Hawaiis of the world, the Puerto Ricos of the world that desperately need a reliable source of energy, particularly after a natural disaster. Offshore oil rigs, things like that. And then nuclear powered shipping, which would allow you to stay at sea longer without having to worry about refueling. And it would also allow you to significantly reduce your emissions. And so that's the benefits of maritime shipping. And right now, if you ask the NRC, can we go license a floating nuclear power plant? They wouldn't bat an eyelash. It's not a... People are oh my God, what's the regulator going to do? And the NRC is yeah, we already did this before. And so we did this a couple decades ago. We don't really think twice about it, right? We can figure it out. The NRC, by the way, for as much as they get criticized, when they get a first of a kind application for innovative new technology, they're really good at figuring out how to license it and deploy it in a pretty effective and time efficient manner. It's when it's trying to boil the ocean and figure out how do we come up with a regulatory framework for any type of technology we could see that things get harder. But when you're actually proposing a technology, they're really good with that. So the NRC just did a workshop a couple weeks ago because they're developing a white paper to look at floating nuclear power plants and nuclear propulsion. Nuclear propulsion gets a little bit more complicated when you have ships that have reactors on it that are going to leave the territorial jurisdiction of the United States and go to other countries. And so a lot of the military guys are oh, well, this is how it works for the Navy. And I'm yeah, but that's because you have a framework in place that allows that to happen. So the IAEA is looking at how this would be deployed. The IMO, the International Maritime Organization, is looking at how this would be deployed. But a lot of companies are planning on developing nuclear at sea. And so I'm excited to see what's happening there. On the space side, there's a lot of companies developing reactors intended for space. A lot of times it's a different iteration of the same technology that you would have for terrestrial or maritime applications. So the same company could be developing all 3 different types of reactors, kind of depending on where the customer base lies. And so there's another companies that are developing space nuclear. But space nuclear is funny because people think it's this massive regulatory issue. And it's really not. If you are doing it for DOE, you're under DOE authorization, just like the DOE authorization for these pilot programs. If you're doing it for Department of Defense, you're under Department of Defense authorization. If you're doing a commercial nuclear reactor for space, then that's stuff you've got to sort out, because you can't build it on Earth without an NRC license. And then you have, like, the NRC regulations aren't designed for safety regulations up in space. And so that is something that the NRC is going to have to sort out. And it's honestly, it's late in the game in doing that. For several years, like, I participated in conversations, including with the NRC, where the NRC never moved past that assumption that any project that would be deployed using nuclear would be a DOD or DOE licensed facility, never assuming that would be a commercial facility. In their defense, I don't know how many commercial companies were going and say, I'm doing a commercial reactor, but they would never have a discussion about, and what would this look like if it was a purely commercial enterprise? They're now having that discussion. And so I think we'll probably see some activity come out of the NRC about, hey, what does this look like if you're deploying a purely commercial project in space, and like where the jurisdictional authorities and boundaries lie? Because at the end of the day, no matter which way you slice it, NRC does not have jurisdiction in space. So like space safety. So you either amend the Atomic Energy Act or you figure out who does.
So we've been talking about nuclear in the U.S. and I mean, it's exciting on various fronts for me personally. But we also know, as you've stated earlier, that there's a ton of development on the nuclear side in both Russia and China.
Yeah.
What do you think is at stake for us here in the U.S. in that global race?
Geopolitical dominance and economic opportunity. Like, period, hard stop, right? I think it's funny. So I've been involved for many years in the conversation about Russia and China, and too many people have been dismissive of China because they're like, well, we're really worried about Russia. And I'm like, okay, well, at the end of the day, they're both eating our lunch on like the international markets. And it's frustrating because even like if I post something on LinkedIn, the number of people who are like, you can't say China's behind us. Look at where we are now. And I was like, yes, we have still not deployed a reactor.
What the numbers? What do the numbers say? Like,
yeah, I mean, the numbers, China. So we are the largest. The United States has the biggest nuclear fleet in the world. In the next 5 years, China will surpass us in terms of number of reactors, number of large scale reactors. China's deploying 10 reactors a year and has since 2022, right? They plan on deploying something like 100 gigawatts more in the next 5 years. And they have so we plan on deploying reactors. We haven't yet.
Right.
So I'm super excited about what we're seeing, but we have to make sure like our potential becomes actualized and like becomes reality, right? We've got to actually build plants, but we have to build, again, more than a first of a kind. So we have a lot of first of a kinds coming down the pike, still not here yet, right? And then the things like constructability and supply chain issues, a lot of companies in the private sector have not even crossed that path yet. Like I was talking to one company the other day, and they're at the point where they're ready to build something. And they're like, we put out an RFP for a valve that we needed, and we submitted it to 100 companies. And they said, guess how many responses we got? And I said, how many? And they said 0.
No way.
Right? 0. So if you need one valve, maybe you can do it yourself. If you need a bunch of those valves, you've got to figure out how to get them, right? So companies are they're very much at the beginning stage of thinking about their supply chain issues. China has already completely onshored their complete supply chain, right? So they already have it for at scale. We don't even have it for first of a kinds. And we have multiple first of kinds, which is great because I say like more shots on goal, the better. But each one of these companies is going to have to go through the learning curve of here's my plan. And then now where do I get X? And like you see this with HALEU because I started working really actively with advanced reactor companies very early on. And like early on, I remember having conversations saying, because I did a lot of uranium enrichment work, and I'm like, where are you guys going to get your fuel? And the thinking was always, it will be here by the time we need it. And I'm like, that is not how supply chains work, right? Like you need commercial signals. You need to invest in the supply chain And like a company is not going to build something on the promise that your business model of deploying fleets of your reactors is going to work. They're going to want to see that happen. So then you see the government step in and try to incentivize and de-risk companies that are planning on deploying HALEU facilities, for example. But it's a very interconnected web. And so when you have a trained workforce, when you have a domesticated supply chain, when you have a fully onshored and reliable supply chain that can grow with you at scale for what you're trying to deploy, when you have a regulator that's already seen the technology, and when you're deploying the same thing over and over while still investing in innovation, and that's what China's doing, that is how you own the global supply chain. That is how you own and dominate a market, right? And when you have the United States going and competing against what China is offering, it makes it really hard to be competitive because we're not packaging it all together, and we still have too much first of kind risk that we have to get past. So we have a lot of things going on that are really good right now in the United States, but we are behind China. We have to figure out how to catch up, and they're investing in things like innovative first of a kind technologies that we haven't, and they're investing a ton of money into fusion that we have not. So these are things that we could have started in leadership for, and we could see that leadership. And by the way, this is not a new playbook. This is exactly what China did with renewables, which make up a huge amount of their annual GDP, is their complete dominance of the technology that goes into running renewable energy projects. So the solar grid and the cables and all the equipment that goes into it, they dominate the market right now. And it's economically really important for them, but also geopolitically is part of the Belt and Road Initiative to help have countries look to the East instead of the West for the relationships that they continue to want to foster.
Wow. Wow. Have you heard, just in the various events that you've been to, conversation with family and friends, that the things that you've shared about China, I know that I've heard, but is that real though? Is that real? No, I think it's real.
It's pretty real.
Yeah.
It's right. Sobering. It is very sobering, especially when you overlay, and we only really scratched upon the data center energy demand. So The Economist does a really good, the newspaper, The Economist, or whatever, I read it online, does a really, really good job at covering data centers and energy use, but also China and energy. And they had a really great one about the fact that China can deploy energy more quickly than any other country in the world and how good they are at it. But also that China, when you look at the global AI dominance race, that China has the lead, not in innovating and developing the technology, but having access to the cheap electrons needed to power the data centers to support the AI generation. And if you sit in meetings, we have a lot of meetings in DC, I call them the secret squirrel meetings, roundtable, invite only, Chatham House rules discussions with key stakeholders, right? A lot of the hyperscalers will tell you, the thing that we worry about that keeps us up at night about whether we can win the AI race is not our ability to stay ahead of China on the technology. It's the fact that we are marrying one of the quickest, fastest moving tech sectors with one of the slowest moving sectors that the US has, which is energy infrastructure development. And we do not have enough energy, and we are not building enough energy. And we need to take down more barriers to enabling technology, to enable energy to be delivered quickly. And you take an energy market that was designed, and our entire energy market, our entire energy infrastructure system was designed for slow load growth, where a utility could decide what it was going to build and had all the time in the world to build it because we had such slow energy demand. Now flip that on its head, right? We have huge increases of energy demand, but it can no longer keep pace with the slow utility movement of taking all the time in the world to figure out what they need. So we're seeing a lot of disruption in the business models that are being explored, the types of technologies that are being deployed, how we meet the energy demand from data centers and industrial load growth in general, and how do we disrupt the energy market so they don't become consistent barriers for us trying to solve the problems we're trying to solve. And at the end of the day, making sure grandma's energy bill doesn't go up because she can't afford it.
Right. So I have other questions. This has been such a fantastic conversation. And I have to ask this question because again, it's something that I mentioned on most episodes about workforce development. It's near and dear to my heart, right? Like, so when you talk about making sure that, we are actually taking action and not just, talking about what we want to do. What are your thoughts on the workforce development piece? Because, we could have this disruption in various parts and domains, but what does that mean for workforce development? We're going to need people to actually sustain and operate these power plants.
Yeah, what we're doing right now is cannibalizing each other. So everybody's leaving the NRC and joining the companies because the companies are, providing private sector benefits, right? And so the NRC is losing people. Companies are growing, but they're oftentimes hiring either out of the NRC or from each other, right? Mm-hmm. There's few new people coming into the space. And I kind of laugh because I constantly have to check LinkedIn to see where my friends are because so many of them, particularly right now, are moving between companies. So and then a number of companies as they grow and scale, like Oklo's growing really fast. X Energy is growing really fast. X Energy, had at the time it went public, it was at the time the largest IPO of 2026. Like, they're just hiring so many people. The Oklos of the world are hiring so many people that there's only so many people that have the necessary background and experience. And I laugh every time a client says, who's a really good regulatory person? And I was like, okay, I can count on my hands how many really good regulatory people I'd recommend. And they're all already at other companies, right? So we need to grow and develop our workforce. And one of the best ways to do that, figure out where your plant is. Because when you have a plant in a location, you have a community that it is going in. Many times you have local universities and you have vocational training programs and you have local economic development packages and state development packages that team together workforce training. If you're in a community that uses unionized labor, the electrical workers will train your entire workforce, and they want to. I joke with people that one of the folks that I have on speed dial is the IBEW local Northern Virginia electrical workers guy, because he's workforce training and development. I'm in. Do what we need to do. He's eager and ready to work, and they'll work with you, but it's a lot easier when you're not a paper reactor working for a company headquarters that's in a random location, but actually building a plant, building manufacturing facilities in a community where you can kind of develop that workforce in the area where you need it. And so I think we're getting there, but we have a rough road ahead of us, and we're going to have a struggle here.
Oh my gosh. So Amy, again, this has been so informative. I hear your passion and I also hear your conviction. And I must admit, it gets me really excited to have had a conversation with you and to know that you two are invested and ensuring that we are successful as a United States. So thank you so much. As I mentioned before, this has been incredible. I would like to pass the mic over to you to do closing remarks, and then we'll do our outro.
Awesome. Thank you for having me here, Dominique. I just want to say, one of the things I think a lot of people realize, but one of the things I just keep echoing every time I have the chance is if we want the future to look different than our past, we don't want to repeat the mistakes of Vogel, and we don't want to repeat the mistakes of past generation, or we're looking to disrupt and do things differently, then you can't do things the same way that you always have before. You can't license in the same way. So we're seeing a lot of disruption at the NRC. I'm psyched to see that, right? You can't, develop a business model the same way that you did before. Because at the end of the day, you can decide you totally want to make a project look a certain way, and the banking community comes in and says, great, and we won't finance. Right? You need to have all these pieces of the puzzle work together, innovate, and disrupt together in a way that completely understands the role of the other, not as a limiting factor, but something that can help inform and accelerate the change that we're trying to see right now. So it takes all of us. It takes you doing this podcast, right? It takes me behind the scenes working with clients. It takes both of us speaking publicly about how to solve for some of these problems. And at the same day, not lose sight of the bigger picture, which is we want electrons. It's great if they're clean. And we've got some geopolitical and national security overlays here that should help drive the conversation. And that's what we're doing now.
Wow. Wow. So for our listeners, I want to ask that if you work in this space, pick one bottleneck you can move this month. And I believe that that's how we'll continue to progress and get things built. Amy, is there anything that our listeners could do to help advocate and push forward your priorities?
No, I mean, I think I love that you just said like the bottlenecks that when I talk to my clients, when I'm figuring out how to commercialize and scale first of a kind technology, think in terms of bottlenecks and then surge. So like find your bottlenecks and surge to those bottlenecks to unstick them. And I think we all need to surge towards a lot of bottlenecks here, whether it's workforce development, supply chain. We're already doing that on regulatory, like project development. Like we all need to surge towards those bottlenecks. And like we all need to have conversations with each other to help break down those walls and figure out how to move forward.
Oh my gosh. Thank you again. Hey guys, if you are interested in learning more about You Can Power, you can find us at youcanpower.org. I am Dominique Cooper. What an incredible episode. See you next time.
Alo, energy without limits. Building education for energy. B, activates communities, educates the next generation, and makes energy careers visible, real, and worth chasing. Learn more at bcamp.org.